Her only weapon was a lie, and it was not even a very good one. It had no poetry, no dazzling cipher. It was a sentence in the passive voice with a date attached. In the districts that had no names, only tax codes, the regime's virtue was obedience, and its sacrament was paperwork. The truth, like oxygen, existed in abundance and was rationed only to keep the machinery from rusting. The rest was classified. A citizen might confess the weather. Everything else was contraband. She had a name then. Mara Keene. She did not choose the work. She was chosen for it, the way a precise blade is taken from a drawer and pressed under a light. The title was new enough to carry novelty, and old enough to be safe to say in a lift. Escape specialist. It meant she could take someone who had been caught in the teeth of the system and ease them free without leaving tooth marks. It meant she could look at a cell and see hinges where others saw walls. They hired her because they believed in containment. They kept her because she never raised her voice. The first flare of rebellion was small enough to pass for courtesy. A boy had been charged with imprecise gratitude in a ration line. The charge carried 6 months in instructional silence, no speech permitted except to repeat an approved phrase every hour. Mara read the boy's file and found the catch. The phrase was, "Thank you for seeing me," repeated to a camera that was never scheduled to turn on. She did not break the rule. She broke the time. She filed a disruption notification that postponed the hour by 1 minute, then another, then 1,000 more. The form blinked. She signed. On paper, the boy complied eternally. In a corridor nobody watched, she led him to a service stair and told him to keep walking until the air smelled like metal that had not been wiped down. It was a victory. It left no mark. The camera log filled with polite ghosts thanking blinks of darkness, and an auditor closed the incident with a note. Subject remains compliant. The boy's absence became a clerical success. The file that might have warmed her was stamped with a phrase she would see often. Nothing happened. Mara learned the rhythm of survival the way a swimmer learns the pulse of a dangerous shore. It is not the wave that kills. It is the impulse to breathe too soon. She learned to exhale between the swells of attention. Spike. A woman whose crime was owning a coat with too many pockets. Drop. A housekeeping sweep that put the coat in a furnace and the woman in a queue. Her lie was born in a lunch break with no lunch. She opened a scheduling system that loved numbers more than people and found that the detention lattice had a maintenance cycle reserved for non-human assets. It was a fiction, a placeholder invented by a programmer who wanted to pass a test. Mara gave the fiction a date, a location, and a safely vague purpose, then spread it like a stain across the calendar. She did not say, "Free these people." She said, "Maintenance evacuation for non-human assets per directive." No one wanted to ask which assets. The error would be contagious. She hand-delivered the paper to a captain whose career wore a perfect shine. He frowned at the word non-human and frowned again at the signatures. He recognized none of them because they belonged to departments that did not exist. This comforted him. Things that did not exist could not be his fault. He stamped it, and the stamp made a sound like a throat closing. The first time she used the lie, 14 bodies walked out behind waste carts and onto a dock stacked with pallets of chloride. They had practiced it for 5 days. Step, swing, breathe on the count of the swinging. A sensor flagged a mismatch of weight against expected trash volume. An algorithm decided the anomaly was within maintenance tolerances and learned to love that error more each hour it survived. A child with a toy stitched from clinic gauze waved at the checkpoint. The guard did not wave back. He adjusted a hat he had been told was part of the uniform, but never seen pictured. The ship lifted without ceremony. Nobody chased. The file later reported a quiet afternoon and excellent throughput. Spike. Drop. Mara's name grew soft-edged in rumor, the way names do when people avoid them for safety and then cannot remember how to pronounce them anymore. She became that one, the way a shape in fog becomes a direction rather than an object. She ate from vended packets while checking corridors for new cameras by counting the screws that held the old ones. Her hands learned the slipperiness of fear and the hardness of calm. She slept in the hour that enforcement reports were compiled, when the city exhaled numbers. The machine she worked for had no face, but it had many mouths. The Office of Denial was one mouth. It issued the kind of letters that closed questions like lids. "We have reviewed your review," one letter said, "and can confirm the issue is not an issue." The Office of Gratitude was another mouth. It sent congratulations to supervisors who had managed to reduce complaints by discouraging them. The Office of Historical Consistency was the hungriest mouth of all. It chewed events into pellets suitable for feeding to school children. Mara made the mistake of winning larger. A whole dormitory had failed the spirit test. It was not much of a test. A blank page and the instruction to write what obedience meant to you without using the letter I. A boy wrote nothing. A teacher wrote too much. An inspector wrote the word remand across the page with the flare of a brush sword. The dormitory was scheduled to disperse. Families separated. Personal objects reduced to ash. All records cross-linked to the phrase, minor ideological dampness. Mara did not change the order. She added a second step. It read, "Prior to dispersal, conduct maintenance evacuation for non-human assets per directive." She duplicated the order across 5 departments that hated one another and could not afford to admit it. She timed the shipments to intersect at a refueling yard where the ground crews were paid a bonus for hitting targets and therefore struck nothing that drifted. She taught the children to say unit instead of family, and they passed through like parts wrapped in oilcloth, not worth stealing or inspecting. A mother folded a child into the hollow of a packing crate and hung a tag around her own neck that said, "Replace if rattling." A manager noticed the surge of traffic and wrote an inquiry that did not look like an inquiry. He asked for an explanation in the form of compliments. The explanations arrived in torrents. She filed them in the places where rain goes in a city too proud to admit it floods. The dormitory went quiet. On paper, it had never existed. On the ground, it disappeared without smell, the way a coin disappears up a sleeve not because the hand is clever, but because the audience is tired. Spike. Drop. An official with ambition for higher floors began to notice that his numbers were beautiful. He had reduced complaints to almost 0. He had eliminated escape attempts. He had optimized. He was summoned to a room where the air carried the signature dryness of systems that do not want to be touched by lungs. He told the story of his numbers, and the people in the room clapped without moving their hands. Afterward, he read a memo that confirmed his suspicion that someone else had done something risky. It contained the sentence, "Corrective capacity is self-correcting," which he liked. He repeated it to a mirror, and the mirror swallowed it with the kind of greed that makes everything look thinner. Mara's lie grew legs. It began to walk without her. Middle managers discovered that writing maintenance evacuation for non-human assets could ease burdens none of them wished to carry. The lie did what good lies do. It told the listener what they wanted to hear. It suggested that the system could care for itself without the risk of admitting it cared for anyone. She remained careful. She collected the people scheduled to vanish like a church gathers candles, quietly, without fuss, knowing that a room feels warmer when light is expected. She taught a grandmother to put her hands inside her sleeves in the way a broken robot does. She taught a man with a limp to put the wrong foot forward first, as if a software patch had been misapplied. She told a child to look at the floor as if the floor were a set of instructions. The regime never tried to make more of them. It tried to make less. Then the regime remembered its first principle. Obedience is the only virtue. Obedience requires objects. The system had mislaid too many. It commissioned a study. The study took the form of a game, a board, a deck of cards, and a spinning needle. Moves were made in departments, not rooms. Points were awarded for terms like compliance persistence and visibility restoration. Beam clickers recorded who looked away. It was not designed to find anyone. It was designed to prove a point. But systems sometimes find what they are built to ignore. It found the word non-human, repeating like a prayer. It found a date that had been shifted forward so many times it had worn a groove. It traced the groove to a person who had the authority to file disruptions, and the demeanor of someone who did not fight gravity so much as negotiate with it. They sent for Mara. They did not warn her. The regime loved the surprise of principle applied abruptly. She walked into the room that dried the air and found 3 chairs. One was behind a table. The other 2 were in front, but not evenly, as if one were the proper place, and the other a confession of uncertainty. She sat in the uneven one. She did not straighten it. They asked her what she did. She told them the truth. It was easier to make the truth sound like a lie when everyone wished to disbelieve it. I applied scheduled maintenance to reduce load, she said. I reclassified assets to minimize risk. She did not say which assets. She did not say whose risk. Were these assets human? The question entered the room like heat. It invited sweat. It wanted a tremble. She did not tremble. The assets belonged to the system, she said. Their status varied according to need. Did you free people? No, she almost said, because she knew what freedom looked like, and it had nothing to do with doors. I reduced friction, she said. It was true. People slid through. A man who had been quiet long enough to appear wise said, "You understand that truth is classified." It was not a question. He needed to hear his voice pronounce the sentence that had kept him alive. Mara nodded. I am authorized to handle sensitive inaccuracies, she said. This was her real job description. She took truths that would harm the machinery and wrapped them in a language the gears could digest. You could not feed a turbine a flower, but you could vaporize the water inside its petals and pretend it always lived as steam. They asked for her signatures. They asked for her lists. She provided spreadsheets that said everything about everything except what it was. They left the room to confer with imaginary advisors. She waited. Waiting gave her space to imagine their verdict, an equation that would only balance if she unbalanced it first. She made 2 decisions while her hands rested on the table. They were the decisions that saved worlds and ruined her life. First, she would not slow the lie down. She would accelerate it until it broke its own tracking system. Second, she would fail, officially. The first decision required years she did not have. She compressed them into a week. She expanded the maintenance calendars to cover more districts than an honest person would try to understand. She found the points of least resistance, the dead elevators that still pinged checksums, the transit platforms where each night the last train arrived empty, and the lights dimmed by 2% as if in sympathy, and she rerouted traffic to them. She taught the lie to sing in frequencies that made auditors' shoulders relax. She poured people through. There were mistakes. A man who could not stop saying thank you, as if gratitude were a muscle cramp. A girl who looked at a guard and saw a human being instead of a barrier. A grandmother who paused to take a pan from a stove no one else wanted. Mara logged each mistake as loss due to known inefficiencies and raised the threshold for acceptable waste. The second decision required a stage and a document. She had both. She wrote her debrief before anyone asked for it. She filed it under the office that did not exist, and then under the one that did. It was the shape of defeat laid flat and labeled with tidy fonts. It said that she had attempted to prevent resource loss through targeted reclassification, but had misapplied a maintenance directive. It said that a handful of non-human assets had gone astray and been recovered. It ended with a sentence that made rooms feel safer. Nothing happened. They arrested her gently. The gentle arrests are worst. They leave no bruise to take home and nurse as proof of meaning. They told her she had endangered efficiency. They told her the blind god of compliance forgave errors it understood. They told her they could not understand this. She was moved to a place that had never needed a name because it had never been meant to appear on a map. The air tasted like boiled metal. This is where omniscience becomes a kind of kindness. We can say that Mara did not weep. We can say she did not break. We can say she listened to the flaking paint of her cell, to the rhythm of a leak that had outlived 3 wardens, and she counted to keep time with a ship she would never see. We can say she used her hour to sleep and her sleep to walk. In the other world, the world her lie made, families stepped onto soil that had not learned to fear boots. The air was not cleaner. It was simply theirs. The place had a name it would not keep. Outpost 12. It would become a town with a bakery that burned the first 3 years of loaves and a clinic that patched scraped knees with the seriousness one uses for treaties. They built a school that taught history by letting children ask questions without looking over their shoulders first. The first lesson was the first law. If someone asks you how you got here, you say, maintenance evacuation for non-human assets per directive, and you smile because the sentence is now a lullaby. None of this appeared in any file. The Office of Historical Consistency convened a panel. The panel reviewed cross-referenced cross-references. They discovered a rash of paperwork all stating with comforting unity that nothing had happened. They smelled a pattern, which is not the same as a truth, and they ordered a corrective documentary that warned of the dangers of overclassification. The documentary opened with an actor saying, "Hiding crimes only hides them from the conscience." Citizens nodded. Supervisors smiled like statues. An editor cut a scene in which an extra looked straight into the camera and said, "We left." The extra was never seen again, because he moved to a town with a bakery that burned its loaves. Spike. Drop. The regime promoted 2 of the officials who had questioned Mara and retired a 3rd without a party. It issued an internal memo praising the Department of Asset Integrity for the successful recovery of several non-human units. It attached a policy change that forbade the use of the word human in maintenance contexts. This reduced opportunities for misunderstanding, and misunderstandings had been the sole cause of every problem any system of sufficient scale had ever faced. Mara's cell changed temperature as seasons passed in corridors that did not know light. A guard who liked counting arrived and left without learning her face. A supervisor had a daughter who learned to draw maps and forgot to hide the paper under her pillow. The map showed a river. Rivers have mouths and do not speak. The supervisor stared at the curved line and felt an ache that had no department code. He took a late tram home and walked a stop too far because walking lets a person think without leaving tracks in a database. He did not change any policy. He wrote one phrase into a folder where nobody would see it. "We are not machines." Mara's debrief lived its assigned life. It was called as witness in other meetings where principles were applied to problems like seasoning to soup. It was cited in a footnote to support a ban on any future position with the title Escape Specialist. In a training course for floor officers, a slide flashed a sentence that no one read aloud. "Be alert to ambiguous scheduling requests. Deny all that do not explicitly concern equipment." A trainee raised a hand and asked what to do if the ambiguity was authorized. The instructor smiled in the way loyalty smiles. "Everything authorized is unambiguous," he said. The class wrote it down and underlined it. It felt like wisdom because it reduced the world to a weight you could carry. There was one more spike, and the drop after it was as soft as a pillow filled with sand. A child in Outpost 12, now called Hutton, because someone liked the way the word sat on the tongue, found a stamp washed up in the river that was not yet on any map. The rubber was cracked from the long winter the town had survived without asking permission. The handle had a grain like a fingerprint, and the base said what all stamps said. "This will make something feel more real." The child pressed it into mud, and then onto her own wrist, and then onto a page from a school book. The mark read, in the old font, "Nothing happened." She showed it to her teacher. The teacher laughed and did not feel like crying until later. "Keep it safe," she said. "It's a very important stamp." The child grew, which is the most human thing. She learned to bake loaves that burned less, and to build walls that kept in heat, without keeping out the wind's reminders. She stamped the bottom of letters with the pattern. It became a joke that never quite softened. "We miss you," the letters said to cousins in other towns. "Nothing happened here." The letters traveled in pouches carried by couriers who memorized routes instead of maps, because memory can be denied and maps can be confiscated. Far away, in a room that dried the air, a man who had once asked Mara the wrong question found his lungs catching for no medical reason. He ordered a review of maintenance calendars to prove his discomfort was unrelated to anything. The report came back with the reassuring conclusion that the small anomalies in the system were self-correcting. He slept better for 3 nights. On the 4th, he dreamed of a stamp he could not stop pressing. He woke feeling that something had been tidied away too thoroughly to ever be truly found again. Mara aged without ceremony. She kept her hands busy with the kind of knots that do not look like knots unless you try to undo them. Once, a woman from the Office of Gratitude visited, because the office was piloting a program to reduce despair by naming it something else. The woman thanked Mara for her service. "What service?" Mara asked. The woman checked her tablet, which did not allow for the tone of a question to alter the logic of an answer. "You prevented waste," she said. "We appreciate every contribution to the machine." She handed Mara a coin with a hole in the middle, so it could be tied to a uniform that no longer existed. When Mara died, it was because bodies wear down even when untouched. The prison ledger marked the time. The regime filed no obituary, because obituaries acknowledged a person who could have lived differently. The cell was cleaned with a lemon-smelling solution that did not know what it covered. The paint flake fell at last. There are worlds free because she refused to slow the lie down. There are towns and valleys and stations and orbits where the maintenance bay is hung with a small plaque that says, in a script learning to be ornamental, "Thank you for seeing me." Children use the phrase as a greeting on the first day of school. Couples whisper it like a promise. It has no sacred power beyond memory and the habit of decency, which is power enough to shame systems that cannot feel shame, but also cannot be shamed. The regime remains. It does not need to change to outlive what challenges it. It only needs to deny the changes happened at all. It replaced the disruption office with one called flow correctness. It banned the letter I from children's assignments on obedience because the lesson had never been learned properly. It retired all stamps that said nothing happened, replacing them with a cleaner design. No incident reportable. The inventories adjusted. The numbers behaved. And because this is a record and records are careful, we end as records end. Debrief. Extract. Keene, M. Subject served in asset integrity under provisional title Escape Specialist. Subject misapplied maintenance directive to cover reclassification errors. Loss limited to non-human assets with negligible value. Oversight review confirms no systemic breach occurred. Corrective measures applied. Title eliminated. Outcome. Nothing happened. The stamp falls. The ink dries. Far downstream where the maps are new, a loaf is lifted from an oven and does not burn. A child seals a letter with a muddy circle and a grin. Humanity's triumph is hidden where it can endure, in habits, not headlines. The archive closes with its sterile kiss, and the silence that follows is the quiet of an engine idling, while a door already opened keeps swinging on its hinge.